At 8:40 that morning, Josephine stepped out of her car in front of the Hennepin County Government Center, with a thin folder pressed against her coat. She had checked it twice before leaving home. Near the courthouse entrance, a woman stood quietly, holding a brown folder of her own. When Josephine walked past, the woman said, "Josephine?" Josephine turned. The woman introduced herself as Marlene Mercer. Then she opened the folder and handed Josephine a single document. Josephine looked at the name printed across the top. It was hers. She had never seen the document before. For a few seconds, she simply stood there in the cold, staring at the page while the courthouse doors opened and closed behind her. She had come that morning believing the hardest part of her marriage was finally over. She had no idea that a stranger was about to show her something that would make her question how much of that marriage she had ever truly understood. Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together. By 6:30 most mornings, Josephine was already awake. The alarm on her phone was set for 7, but she rarely needed it anymore. Years of keeping track of other people's schedules had trained her body to wake before the day asked anything of her. That Tuesday morning in Minneapolis, she lay still for a few seconds, listening to the furnace hum through the walls. Then she reached for her phone. There were 3 notifications: a reminder about the property tax payment, a message from the dentist confirming Gabriel's appointment for the following Thursday, and an email from one of Gabriel's project supervisors asking whether Gabriel would be available for a 10 o'clock call. Josephine answered the last one first. He'll be available at 10. She hesitated before sending it. Gabriel had not actually told her that he would be available, but she knew his schedule better than he did sometimes. She knew which meetings could move, which clients preferred morning calls, which subcontractors tended to call only when something had gone wrong, and which projects were currently taking most of his attention. She sent the message. Then she got out of bed. By 7, the kitchen was warm, the coffee maker was running, and Josephine was standing at the counter with a notebook open beside her. The notebook wasn't for herself. It had Gabriel's week written across 2 pages. Monday, downtown project meeting. Tuesday, supplier calls, site visit, dinner with a potential client. Wednesday, accountant. Thursday, dentist. Friday, meeting with the bank. Josephine had started keeping lists like this when Gabriel's construction company was still small enough for the 2 of them to understand nearly everything happening inside it. Back then she had enjoyed it. There had been something satisfying about taking a pile of loose information and making it orderly. A missed invoice, a contractor who needed a callback, a client who had forgotten a deadline, a permit that needed to be checked. Josephine liked solving those problems. She liked being useful. The trouble was that, over the years, usefulness had quietly become her identity. She checked the household account before making breakfast. The electric bill was due in 4 days. The mortgage payment had already cleared. She moved money between accounts, paid the water bill, and made a note to call the insurance company later. Gabriel walked into the kitchen wearing a dark sweater and jeans. "You're up early," he said. Josephine looked at the clock. "It's almost 8. Gabriel smiled. "For you, that's early." She gave him a small smile. His phone was already in his hand. "Did you see the message from Daniel?" "Yes, he needs the revised numbers before 10. Gabriel looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Because he emailed me." He shook his head with a quiet laugh. "You probably know what's happening at that company better than I do." Josephine laughed too. There was affection in the moment. That mattered. Their marriage had not begun with cruelty. It had begun with partnership. Gabriel kissed her forehead before opening the refrigerator. "Where's the yogurt?" "Second shelf." He opened the refrigerator, looked directly at the yogurt, and still didn't see it. Josephine reached over and handed it to him. "Right there. That's why I keep you around." He said it lightly. Josephine smiled, but after he left the kitchen, she stood still for a moment. She wasn't offended. Not exactly. She simply wondered when being the person who remembered everything had stopped feeling like a strength and started feeling like an obligation. The question disappeared when her phone rang. A family member needed help with an appointment. Then the insurance company called. Then Gabriel texted asking whether she had seen an email from his accountant. By 9:30, Josephine had solved 4 problems that had not belonged to her when she woke up. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee growing cold. For a few minutes nobody needed anything from her. That silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, it made her uncomfortable. Her eyes drifted toward the small desk near the living room window. A folder sat there. Inside were old documents from before Gabriel's company had become the center of their lives. Certificates, training records, a few notes from courses she had taken in project administration, and an old resume. Josephine had not opened that folder in months. She looked at it now. Before marriage became complicated, before Gabriel's company consumed their schedules, she had imagined herself working in development administration. She had liked organizing projects, coordinating people, solving logistical problems, and watching complicated plans slowly become real. She had been good at it. She still was. She just hadn't used those skills for herself in a long time. Josephine closed her laptop and stood. The folder remained on the desk. She walked past it without opening it. She told herself the same thing she had told herself many times before. There would be time later, once the company was more stable, once Gabriel didn't need so much help, once life became less complicated, she would figure out what came next. For now, there were bills to pay, appointments to remember, and a husband who depended on her. Making sure everyone else knew what came next. She'd simply stopped asking herself the same question. 3 years earlier, Josephine had opened an email that made her sit down. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she had been standing at the kitchen counter sorting receipts when her laptop chimed. She almost ignored it. Most of the messages arriving during the day were ordinary. Bills, appointment confirmations, questions about Gabriel's projects. This one had a subject line she hadn't seen in years. Project Administration Manager. Interview request. Josephine stared at it. Then she read it again. The position was with a regional development company in Minneapolis. The salary was better than she had expected. The benefits were solid. More importantly, the position offered exactly the kind of work she had once imagined doing: project coordination, development schedules, vendor communication, budget tracking, administrative oversight. It wasn't a dream job in the way people sometimes talked about dreams. It was something better. It was realistic. It was work she understood and genuinely enjoyed. Josephine forwarded the email to herself and printed a copy. She carried the paper from the printer to the kitchen table. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to have a professional identity again. She could almost see herself leaving the house in the morning with a laptop bag. She could picture sitting in meetings where people introduced her by her own job title. She could imagine earning her own paycheck again. The thought made her nervous. It also made her smile. That evening she waited until Gabriel came home. He arrived after 7, tired from a construction site, his boots carrying dried mud across the entryway. Josephine noticed the mud but didn't mention it. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. Gabriel loosened his jacket. "I'm starving." They ate at the kitchen table. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things: a delayed shipment, a client who had changed specifications, a neighbor's new fence. Then Josephine put down her fork. "I got an email today." Gabriel looked up. "Good or bad?" "Good." She smiled. "I have an interview." His expression changed slightly. "For what?" Josephine told him. He didn't respond immediately. Then he leaned back in his chair. "That's a pretty serious position." "I know. You applied without telling me? I didn't think I'd get an interview." Gabriel nodded slowly. There was nothing obviously wrong with his reaction. That was part of what made the moment difficult. He wasn't angry. He didn't tell her not to go. Instead, he began asking questions. "What are the hours?" "Probably 8 to 5. And the commute?" "About 35 minutes. Who handles the house?" Josephine blinked. "I do." "I know. I'm asking what happens when you're working." "We'll figure it out." Gabriel nodded. "What about my schedule? What about it?" "If I have a site emergency, then we'll handle it." He rubbed his chin. "And if the company needs something from me while you're at work?" Josephine looked at him. "Gabriel, I won't be disappearing." "I know." He reached across the table and touched her hand. "I'm not saying you shouldn't do it." The reassurance softened her. "Just want us to think about the timing." Josephine nodded. The conversation continued. They discussed childcare even though they didn't have children. They discussed his growing workload. They discussed household responsibilities, her commute, and whether she would have enough energy for everything. Every question sounded reasonable. By the end of the conversation, Josephine was no longer thinking about the interview. She was thinking about whether accepting the position would make her a selfish wife. That was the first thing she didn't tell Gabriel. The next morning she attended the interview. She came home excited. "They liked me," she said. Gabriel was reviewing papers at the dining table. "That's good. They want me for a second interview." He looked up. "That's fast." "I know." She smiled. "I think I could actually get it." Gabriel smiled back. "I knew you were capable." The words should have made her happy. Instead, she noticed that he didn't ask whether she wanted it. 2 days later, Gabriel's company landed a major commercial contract. He came home excited. "This could change everything," he said. Josephine listened as he described the project, the size, the revenue, the risks, the opportunities. She was proud of him. Then Gabriel said quietly, "I may need you more than ever." Josephine understood what he meant. She didn't answer. That night she lay awake. She thought about the job. Then she thought about Gabriel's company. She told herself that one opportunity could be postponed. His business couldn't. A week later, she called the development company. She asked whether the position could be delayed. It couldn't. The hiring manager sounded disappointed. Josephine apologized. After the call ended, she sat in her car for several minutes before going inside. She told Gabriel she had declined. He hugged her. "I know that wasn't easy." Josephine rested her head against his chest. "I'll find something later." "You will." And she believed him. For a while. Months passed, then years. Josephine never applied for another position. She became more involved in Gabriel's company instead. She organized invoices. She reviewed schedules. She communicated with vendors. She helped prepare documents. Gabriel often told people that his wife was the reason he could focus on growing the business. Josephine liked hearing it. It made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. Then years later, she found an old email while searching through a backup folder. It was a short exchange between Gabriel and someone associated with the development company. Josephine read it once. Then again, the message was polite, professional. There was no accusation, no insult, just a carefully worded concern about whether Josephine would be able to manage the demands of the position while supporting her husband's growing business. The recipient had apparently become uncertain about hiring her. Josephine felt the room go strangely quiet. She found another message, then another. Gabriel had never told her. He had not forced the company to reject her. He had simply made them doubt her availability. That distinction would have mattered to him. It mattered less to Josephine. When Gabriel came home that evening, she was waiting. "Did you contact them?" He stopped. "Contact who?" "The development company." For the first time, Josephine saw uncertainty cross his face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. "You went looking through old emails. Answer me." Gabriel sighed. "I was worried. You told them I wouldn't be reliable." "I told them you had responsibilities here. You made them think I couldn't handle the job." "I never said that." "You didn't have to." Gabriel looked frustrated. "Josephine, I was trying to protect what we were building." She stared at him. "What about what I was building?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I thought we were building the same thing." Josephine wanted to argue. Instead, she looked away. That night, she placed the old resume back inside the folder. She didn't throw it away. She didn't apply for another job either. But something had changed. For the first time, Josephine understood that Gabriel could influence her life without ever telling her no, and somehow that frightened her more than a direct refusal would have. After the conversation about the development company, Josephine did not suddenly become suspicious of everything Gabriel did. That would have been easier. Instead, she did what people often do when they discover something uncomfortable about someone they love. She tried to explain it away. Gabriel had been afraid. The company had been growing. He had been under pressure. He had believed he was protecting their future. And if Josephine was being honest with herself, part of her understood why he might have thought that way. Understanding him made it easier not to confront him. So life continued. Gabriel's company grew faster than either of them had expected. The small office he had once rented above a printing shop became a larger space across town. His staff increased. His projects became more expensive. His name began appearing in local business publications. People congratulated Josephine when they saw her. "You must be so proud." She always smiled. "I am." And she was. But there was another sentence she heard almost as often. "You must be the woman behind the man." Josephine used to laugh when people said it. Eventually, she stopped finding it funny. Gabriel became responsible for increasingly complicated decisions. Banks called, clients called, investors called, his employees called. He began traveling between construction sites and meetings, sometimes leaving before sunrise and returning after Josephine had already eaten dinner. Josephine adapted. She always adapted. If Gabriel was traveling, she handled the household. If he had a meeting, she made sure the documents were ready. If he forgot an appointment, she reminded him. If he needed something signed, she found it. At first, Gabriel thanked her. Later, he simply expected it. That change happened so gradually that Josephine could not identify the exact day it began. The same thing happened with money. In the early years, they had discussed everything. They had sat at the kitchen table with calculators and bank statements, deciding what they could afford. Eventually, Gabriel began handling the larger financial decisions himself. "I'll take care of that," he would say. Josephine rarely objected. The business accounts were complicated and Gabriel understood them better. When investments came up, he usually explained the decision after it had already been made. When insurance changed, he handled the paperwork. When the mortgage was refinanced, he told Josephine what they had decided. "We got a better rate," he said. Josephine nodded. She trusted him. That word mattered. Trust was the reason she didn't ask for every document. Trust was the reason she didn't insist on sitting in every meeting. Trust was the reason she accepted phrases like, "I'll handle it," without hearing the quiet message underneath them. Over time, Josephine's world became smaller without looking smaller from the outside. They had a comfortable home. They traveled occasionally. They attended dinners with Gabriel's business associates. They belonged to a neighborhood where people recognized them. From a distance, their marriage looked successful. Inside the house, however, their conversations became increasingly predictable. Josephine would raise a concern. Gabriel would explain why it wasn't necessary. She would ask another question. He would become defensive. She would sense the conversation changing. Then she would stop. One evening, she asked about an investment she had never seen before. Gabriel was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing a spreadsheet. "What investment?" "The account you mentioned last week." He didn't look up. "It's part of the portfolio." "I know. I just wanted to understand what it is." Gabriel finally looked at her. "Why?" Josephine paused. "Because it's our money." "I know that. Then why can't I ask?" "You can ask." His tone had changed, Josephine noticed. "I am asking." Gabriel leaned back. "Josephine, not everything has to become a discussion." She stared at him. "I didn't say everything did. I have enough pressure without having to justify every financial decision I make." She felt the familiar temptation to apologize. Instead, she said quietly, "I'm not asking you to justify yourself. I'm asking you to explain something to me." Gabriel closed the laptop. "Sometimes I think you don't understand how much responsibility I'm carrying." The words landed harder than they should have. Josephine looked down. "Maybe I don't." He softened. "I don't mean that badly. I know." But she did not know. Not anymore. After that, Josephine asked fewer questions. Gabriel noticed the change but interpreted it differently. He thought she was becoming emotionally distant. She thought she was learning when to stay quiet. Neither understood that silence was becoming the language of their marriage. Months later, Gabriel mentioned that he had a dinner meeting with 2 clients. Josephine asked what time he would be home. "Probably late." She nodded. "Okay." He looked at her. "That's it? What else should I say?" "I don't know. You used to ask more." Josephine forced a smile. "You said it would be late." Gabriel shook his head. "There's something different about you lately." Josephine almost laughed. There was something different about both of them, but she didn't say it. Instead, she returned to folding laundry. By then, Gabriel had begun describing Josephine to other people as anxious. He didn't do it maliciously, at least not in his mind. He told his brother that she worried too much. He told a close friend that she had become withdrawn. He occasionally said that she was struggling emotionally. Those statements were not completely false. Josephine was anxious. She was withdrawn. She was exhausted. But nobody asked what had made her that way, and Josephine had stopped explaining. The final shift came on an ordinary Thursday evening. There had been no major argument, no affair, no dramatic discovery. Gabriel came home, placed his keys on the counter, and stood quietly in the kitchen. Josephine looked up from her laptop. "Everything okay?" He took a breath. "I've been thinking." She waited. "I think we're better off ending this." For several seconds, Josephine didn't understand what he meant. Then she looked at him properly. Gabriel wasn't angry. He wasn't crying. He looked almost relieved. Josephine closed the laptop. After years of keeping his life organized, she suddenly had no idea what she was supposed to do with her own. She thought the hardest part would be losing her husband. She didn't yet understand that the divorce would force her to confront something much more painful. How much of herself she had slowly handed away, while believing she was building a life with him. Gabriel did not file for divorce the next morning. That would have been easier for Josephine to understand. Instead, he spent several weeks behaving almost normally. He went to work, he answered emails, he ate dinner. He even asked Josephine once whether she had slept well. That was what unsettled her most. The decision seemed to have changed everything for her, but Gabriel moved through the house as though the decision had already been made long ago. Then, on a Monday afternoon, Josephine received an email from an attorney's office. She read the first sentence 3 times. Gabriel had filed for divorce. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her hands resting motionless beside it. For several minutes she couldn't make herself scroll. The room looked exactly as it had that morning. The same coffee mug, the same fruit bowl, the same stack of unopened mail. Nothing in the kitchen had changed. Yet Josephine suddenly felt as though she had walked into someone else's house. She eventually opened the attached documents. There were pages about finances, property, income, expenses, and the marriage itself. Gabriel's attorney had prepared everything carefully. His annual income was listed. His business interests were listed. His contributions to the household were documented. Josephine's employment history was included. Or, more accurately, the absence of it was included. The document stated that Josephine had not maintained outside employment for several years. That was true. They mentioned that Gabriel had provided most of the household income. That was also true. They described disagreements about money. True. They described periods when Josephine had become withdrawn and difficult to communicate with. Also true. Josephine kept reading. The problem wasn't that Gabriel had lied. The problem was that he had told the truth selectively. There was no mention of the development position she had once been offered. Nothing about the years she had spent organizing parts of his business. Nothing about the evenings she had stayed awake handling invoices while he traveled. Nothing about the conversations in which he had encouraged her to postpone her career. Nothing about the decisions she had made because she believed they were temporary sacrifices for their shared future. The documents did not say Josephine had been incapable. They simply made it easy for someone who didn't know her to assume she had chosen not to work because she had little interest in doing so. She felt her throat tighten. Gabriel had not invented a woman who didn't exist. He had taken pieces of the real Josephine and arranged them into someone smaller. A woman who depended on him. A woman who had no recent career. A woman who was emotionally unstable. A woman whose husband had carried the family while she had gradually withdrawn. Josephine closed the laptop. She walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time she wondered whether Gabriel had been preparing for the divorce before he told her he wanted one. That question frightened her. Not because preparation was necessarily wrong, because it meant he had been thinking about the end of their marriage while she had still been thinking about how to save it. The following evening Gabriel came home and found her sitting at the kitchen table. "Did you get the documents?" he asked. Josephine looked at him. "Yes." He nodded. "I wanted everything to be clear. Clear, financially, legally. I don't want this to become ugly." She almost laughed. "Ugly?" Gabriel pulled out a chair. "Josephine, we're both adults." She looked down at the papers. "You made me sound like I haven't done anything with my life." "That isn't what I did." "Then what did you do?" He paused. "I gave them the facts." Josephine looked back at him. The facts? Yes. She picked up one page. The fact that I haven't worked outside the home? Yes. The fact that you paid most of the bills? Yes. The fact that I've been emotionally exhausted? Gabriel sighed. I didn't say exhausted. You didn't have to. He looked away. Josephine felt something inside her settle. Not peace. Something colder. She had spent years believing that if she explained herself clearly enough, Gabriel would eventually understand what she meant. Now she was beginning to realize that he understood her perfectly well. He simply preferred a different version of the truth. Gabriel stood. I don't want us to fight. Josephine watched him walk away. Neither did she. But she was beginning to understand that avoiding conflict had never protected her. It had only made it easier for other people to define what happened to her. And for the first time since Gabriel had said the marriage was over, Josephine felt something stronger than grief. She felt the need to find out exactly what she had been agreeing to all those years. Not because she wanted to punish Gabriel, because she could no longer afford not to know. The next morning, Josephine called Renee. She didn't tell her sister everything over the phone. There were some things that sounded too frightening when spoken aloud. Instead, she asked Renee to come over after work. Renee arrived just after 6 with a grocery bag in one hand and the expression she always wore when she knew Josephine was trying to pretend everything was fine. She put the bag on the counter. What's going on? Josephine looked at her. Gabriel filed. Renee went still. He actually filed? Josephine nodded. For a moment, neither sister spoke. Then Renee pulled out a chair. Sit down. Josephine almost smiled. You sound like Mom. Mom would have brought food and told you to stop looking at your phone. She would. Renee sat beside her. Josephine slid the divorce documents across the table. Renee read them slowly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't immediately call Gabriel a liar. That was one reason Josephine trusted her. When Renee finished, she placed the papers down. What do you think? Josephine stared at the table. I think he made me sound like a burden. Renee shook her head. No, he made you sound dependent. Aren't those the same thing? No. Josephine looked at her. Renee leaned forward. Being dependent on somebody financially isn't the same as being incapable of contributing. Josephine said nothing. Renee studied her face. When was the last time you made a major decision without first wondering what Gabriel would think? Josephine opened her mouth, then stopped. She tried to think of an answer. There was the new car they had bought. Gabriel had chosen it. The investment account. Gabriel had handled it. The house renovations. Gabriel had negotiated them. Her old career opportunity. She had asked Gabriel what he thought. Even small things had become habits. Where they traveled. Which holidays they spent with his family. Which business dinners she attended. Josephine lowered her eyes. I don't know. Renee's expression softened. That answer scares you, doesn't it? Josephine nodded. I don't know when it happened. Renee reached across the table. Then don't try to solve the whole marriage tonight. Start with something you can understand. What? Your own money. Josephine looked confused. I know what we have. Do you? The question wasn't accusatory. It was practical. Renee asked Josephine what accounts existed. Josephine named the household checking account, the savings account, and several accounts connected to Gabriel's business. Renee asked what the balances were. Josephine knew some, not all. What about investments? I know we have them. How much? Josephine hesitated. I don't know. Renee sat back. That needs to change. The next morning, Josephine began looking. She opened folders she had ignored for years. She found bank statements, insurance documents, tax records, investment statements, mortgage paperwork. Some she understood, others required careful reading. Then she found a folder containing documents she remembered signing. She recognized her signature. That was what frightened her. She remembered sitting beside Gabriel at the dining room table years earlier while he explained that they needed to update some financial paperwork connected to the business. She had been tired. She had trusted him. She had signed where he told her to sign. Now she looked at the documents again. One page contained information connected to one of Gabriel's construction projects. Josephine read it twice. Then she called Gabriel. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, I'm looking at some paperwork." "What paperwork?" She gave him the document number. There was a pause. "What about it?" "Why is my information here?" Gabriel exhaled. "Josephine, that's old business paperwork." "I know it's old. I'm asking why my information is on it." "Because you're my wife. That doesn't explain it." Another pause. "You're looking at business paperwork you don't understand." Josephine went completely still. She had heard those words before. Not those exact words, perhaps, but the meaning was familiar. She had asked a question. He had responded by making her feel unqualified to ask it. "Then explain it to me," she said. "I don't have time to go through old files. Gabriel, I'll have my attorney look at it." "Why your attorney?" "Because this is a legal matter." Josephine stared at the document. "Fine." She ended the call. For several seconds she remained at the table. Then she picked up the document again. There was nothing dramatic about it. No red warning, no confession, just numbers, dates, names, and her signature. But something inside Josephine had shifted. For years she had accepted not understanding, because she trusted the person who said everything was under control. Now she realized that trust had left her vulnerable. She didn't know yet whether Gabriel had done anything wrong. She wasn't even sure whether the document meant what she feared it might mean. But she knew one thing. She was done accepting because I said so as an explanation. Renee called that evening. "Did you find anything?" "I found questions." Renee was quiet. "That's enough for tonight." Josephine looked at the folder. "No." She shook her head, even though Renee couldn't see her. "I think I've spent enough years not looking." The morning of the divorce hearing, Josephine woke before her alarm. It was still dark outside. For a few seconds she lay beneath the covers and listened to the quiet house. There had been a time when mornings like this meant checking Gabriel's schedule before she even got out of bed. Not anymore. She reached for her phone, turned off the alarm, and sat up. The folder containing her divorce papers was on the chair beside the bed. She picked it up and checked it once, then again. Her attorney had already told her that she didn't need to bring much. The important documents had been submitted. There was no reason to keep checking. But Josephine had spent years checking things. It was easier to check the folder than to think about what the day meant. She showered, dressed carefully, and stood in front of the bedroom mirror. She wore a dark navy suit she had bought years earlier for one of Gabriel's company dinners. It still fit. She fastened a simple pair of earrings and looked at herself. 32 years old, divorcing her husband, unsure about her finances, unsure about her future. And strangely, more certain than she had been in years that she needed to know the truth about her own life. She drove toward downtown Minneapolis just after 8. The roads were busy. People were going to work. Buses moved through traffic. Someone in the next lane was eating breakfast behind the wheel. A delivery truck blocked part of an intersection. Ordinary life continued around her. That almost made the morning harder. Josephine had expected the world to look different. It didn't. At 8:37, she parked near the Hennepin County Government Center. She sat in the car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. She could see people entering the building. Attorneys carrying briefcases, employees with identification badges, people checking their phones, families walking together. Nobody knew that Josephine was about to walk into a room where years of her life would be reduced to documents and statements. She picked up her folder. For a moment she thought about calling Renee. Instead, she put the phone away. She had spent too many years needing someone beside her before she trusted herself to move. She got out of the car. The morning air was cold enough to make her pull her coat tighter. She walked toward the courthouse entrance. Then she saw Gabriel. He was standing near the doors with his attorney. His coat was perfectly pressed. His posture was straight. He looked calm, prepared, almost exactly the way he had looked on the night he told her their marriage should end. He saw her. Their eyes met. Gabriel gave her a small nod. Josephine returned it. She noticed something she hadn't expected. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised by his confidence anymore. He had always been good at walking into difficult situations, as though he had already decided how they would end. His attorney said something to him. Gabriel listened. Josephine looked away. She tightened her grip on the folder and took another step toward the entrance. Then a woman's voice came from behind her. "Josephine?" She stopped. The voice wasn't familiar. Josephine turned. A woman stood several feet away. She appeared to be in her late 50s. Her dark coat was buttoned tightly against the cold, and she held a brown folder against her chest. The woman wasn't dressed like an attorney. She wasn't carrying herself like someone who had come to court for a hearing. She looked nervous, but she was watching Josephine carefully. "Yes?" Josephine said. The woman took a few steps closer. "My name is Marlene Mercer." Josephine stared at her. The surname meant nothing at first. Then something about it caught in her memory. Mercer. She had heard Gabriel mention the name years earlier. Not often, but enough. Josephine looked toward Gabriel. He was still speaking with his attorney and had not noticed them. Marlene followed Josephine's glance. "Your husband doesn't know I'm here." Josephine's stomach tightened. "What is this about?" Marlene didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the brown folder. "I need you to see something." She removed a single sheet of paper. Josephine looked at it but didn't take it. "What is it?" "Something my husband kept." "Your husband?" "Daniel Mercer." Josephine recognized the name. Daniel had worked for Gabriel's company. She remembered seeing him at a few company gatherings. Quiet, careful, always carrying a notebook. "He was Gabriel's project manager," Josephine said. Marlene nodded. "He was." Something in the way she said the word made Josephine uncomfortable. Marlene held out the document. Josephine finally took it. Her eyes moved across the page. There were dates, financial information, references to a construction project, and near the top was a name she knew better than anyone. Josephine. Her breath caught. She looked again. The information was connected to her, not a household bill, not a document she remembered signing. Something else. Something connected to Gabriel's business. Josephine looked at Marlene. "I've never seen this." "I know." "How did you get it?" "My husband kept records." "Why?" Marlene's expression changed. "Because he spent years trying to prove that the story people told about him wasn't the whole truth." Josephine looked back at the page. The courthouse doors opened behind her. People walked past them without slowing down. Gabriel still hadn't turned around. For a moment, Josephine felt suspended between two lives. Inside the courthouse was the divorce she had spent weeks preparing for. In her hand was a document she couldn't explain. And standing in front of her was a woman whose dead husband had apparently spent years trying to uncover something connected to Gabriel. Josephine looked at the name on the page again. Her own name. She had walked into the courthouse believing she was there to defend herself against the end of her marriage. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether she had been defending herself against only part of the truth. Josephine remained outside the courthouse with the document in her hand. She had stopped noticing the people moving around them, the traffic, the opening doors, the attorneys walking past. Even Gabriel, standing only a short distance away, had disappeared from her attention. She looked at Marlene. "How did you know to find me here?" Marlene took a breath. "I found your name in my husband's records." Josephine looked down at the paper again. "Daniel kept this?" "He kept a lot of things." "Why?" "Because nobody believed him." There was no anger in Marlene's voice. That surprised Josephine. She had expected resentment, maybe bitterness, maybe the kind of accusation that would make her immediately defensive. Instead, Marlene sounded tired. "My husband worked for Gabriel for several years," she continued. "He was a project manager. He was good at his job. He wasn't perfect, but he was careful." Josephine remembered him. Daniel had always been quiet at company gatherings. While other people talked about contracts and expansion, he usually listened. "He was blamed for a financial problem," Marlene said. "A large project went over budget. There were transactions nobody could explain properly. Some records didn't match. When people started asking questions, Daniel's name was already close to everything." Josephine frowned. "Was he responsible?" Marlene looked directly at her. "That's the question I've been trying to answer for years." Josephine didn't know what to say. Marlene continued. "Daniel said he had raised concerns before things went wrong. He said some decisions had been approved by people above him, but by then the company needed an explanation, one person they could point to. And that person was Daniel." "Yes." Josephine looked back toward the courthouse. "Did he take money?" "No. The answer came quickly. Then Marlene corrected herself. At least I never found evidence that he did. Josephine appreciated the distinction. You don't know? I know what my husband told me. I know what the records show, and I know what happened to him afterward. Marlene's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. He lost his job. People stopped returning his calls. Former colleagues stopped inviting him anywhere. He spent years trying to explain that the story wasn't complete. What happened to him? He died 3 years ago. Josephine lowered the document. I'm sorry. Marlene nodded. Thank you. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Marlene said quietly, I'm not here because I hate your husband. Josephine looked at her. I need you to understand that. I do. I don't know everything Gabriel did. I don't know everything Daniel did. I don't even know whether every conclusion I've reached is correct. That honesty made Josephine listen more carefully. Marlene opened her folder again. My husband kept notes, dates, emails, copies of documents, things he thought might matter someday. She pulled out several pages. These came from his storage. Josephine glanced at them. One contained a project reference, another showed a payment, another included a notation beside a financial account. Then Marlene placed a fourth page in front of her. Josephine recognized the account number. It was connected to their household finances. Her stomach tightened. Why is this here? I don't know yet. Does this prove Gabriel did something? No. Josephine looked up sharply. Marlene shook her head. That is why I came to you instead of going straight to an attorney and making an accusation. Josephine studied her. You could have. I could have. Why didn't you? Because my husband spent the last years of his life being accused without people checking what they actually knew. Marlene's voice softened. I won't do that to somebody else. Josephine looked at the papers again. There was no dramatic confession, no single page explaining everything. Just fragments, dates, numbers, references. Her name appearing where she couldn't explain why it appeared. She felt frightened, but she refused to let fear answer questions that the evidence had not answered. What exactly do you think happened? Marlene paused. I think your husband knew more about that project than he admitted. Josephine swallowed. And you think he used my information? I think documents connected to you were involved. That isn't the same thing. No. Marlene nodded. It isn't. Josephine appreciated that. She looked toward the courthouse entrance. What do you want me to do? Nothing today if you don't want to. Josephine looked surprised. Marlene closed the folder. I only wanted you to see what I found. What you do with it is your decision. That sentence stayed with Josephine. Her decision. For years, Gabriel had told her what was practical, what was necessary, what was best. Now a grieving widow was standing in front of her, refusing to tell her what to believe. Josephine looked down at the document bearing her name. For the first time that morning, she didn't feel powerless. She felt uncertain, and strangely, uncertainty was easier to bear than being certain about a life she no longer recognized. She gathered the papers carefully. I need copies. Marlene nodded. I made them. Josephine looked at her. Thank you. Marlene gave a small nod. Then she said, Josephine, don't assume this proves everything. I won't. And don't assume it proves nothing. Josephine looked at the courthouse doors. Won't do that either. She folded the document and placed it inside her folder. Then she turned toward the entrance. This time, she wasn't walking in simply to defend herself. She was walking in with questions of her own. Josephine did not tell Gabriel about Marlene that morning. She walked into the courthouse with the document tucked beneath her divorce papers and took a seat beside her attorney. Gabriel was across the room. He glanced at her once. Then again. Josephine wondered whether he could tell that something had changed. Probably not. She had spent too many years learning how to hide what she was thinking. The hearing itself was procedural. There were questions about financial disclosures, property, and the next steps in the divorce. Nothing dramatic happened. But Josephine barely heard half of it. Her mind kept returning to the document in her folder. By the time she left the courthouse, she had made one decision. She needed to know what was true, not what Marlene believed, not what Gabriel claimed, not what Josephine feared, what was actually true. That evening she called Renee. Can you come over? Renee heard something in her voice. Is something wrong? I don't know yet. Renee arrived less than an hour later. Josephine placed the documents on the dining table. Renee read them slowly. She didn't touch anything until Josephine explained where they came from. Daniel Mercer? Renee asked. Josephine nodded. The project manager? Yes. Renee looked at the papers again. And Marlene gave you these outside court? Yes. Did she accuse Gabriel of anything? No. That matters. I know. Josephine sat down. I don't want to assume anything. Good. Renee pulled out a chair. Then we start with what you can verify. They began with the easiest records. Bank statements, household accounts, old refinancing documents. Josephine opened files she hadn't examined in years. Some documents were ordinary, others made her pause. She found a refinancing package from several years earlier. She remembered signing it, but she had never read every page. Now she did. One section referenced financial information associated with Gabriel's business. Josephine frowned. Why would this be included? Renee leaned closer. Do you remember signing this? Yes. Do you remember what Gabriel told you? Josephine thought about it. He said it was part of restructuring the household finances. Did you read it? Not carefully. Renee didn't criticize her. That almost made it worse. Josephine continued searching. They found correspondence between Gabriel and an accountant, then an email concerning a construction project, then another document containing information Josephine recognized from the page Marlene had shown her. None of it proved fraud, but the pieces were beginning to touch. Josephine wrote dates on a legal pad. She drew lines between them. The first document was dated shortly before the financial problems Daniel had raised. The refinancing paperwork came earlier. The business correspondence came later. Josephine stared at the dates. There's something here. Renee nodded. There might be. Josephine opened another folder. This one contained old emails. She searched Gabriel's name. Hundreds appeared. She narrowed the search by the name of the development company that had offered her the job years earlier. One message appeared. Josephine opened it. Her heart began beating faster. It was an exchange between Gabriel and someone at the company. The date was from shortly before the position had been withdrawn. She read the message again. Gabriel hadn't explicitly asked them to reject her. He had described her as uncertain about returning to full-time work. He mentioned that his business required substantial support from her. He questioned whether she would be able to maintain the demands of the position. Nothing in the message was technically false, but Josephine knew what had happened afterward. The company had stopped pursuing her. She sat back. Renee watched her. This isn't about Daniel, Josephine said. No, this happened years before. Yes. Josephine rubbed her forehead. That means this isn't one thing. Renee didn't answer. Josephine looked at the papers spread across the table. She remembered the conversation with Gabriel. Was trying to protect what we built. At the time, she had heard concern. Now she heard something else. He had made a decision about her future without telling her. Then he had allowed her to believe the decision had been hers. Josephine felt tears gather in her eyes. She wiped them away. I thought he was helping me. Renee reached for her hand. Maybe he thought he was. That doesn't make it okay. No. Josephine looked down. She had spent years imagining that betrayal would feel like anger. Instead, it felt like grief. She wasn't discovering that Gabriel had been a stranger. She was discovering that the man she knew had parts of himself she had never been allowed to see. Over the next several days, Josephine continued looking. She requested copies of financial records through the proper channels. She reviewed household paperwork. She compared dates. She made notes whenever something didn't make sense. And she deliberately recorded evidence that contradicted her own suspicions. If a document supported Gabriel's explanation, she kept it. If something was ambiguous, she marked it as ambiguous. Renee noticed. You're being very careful. I have to be. Why? Josephine looked at the growing stack of papers. Because I don't want to become the kind of person who decides the conclusion first and then searches for evidence. That mattered to her. She had watched Daniel's story through Marlene's eyes. She understood how easily a person could be destroyed by a version of events that became accepted before anyone examined it properly. Josephine wasn't going to make the same mistake, but by the end of the week, one conclusion was becoming difficult to avoid. Gabriel had not simply made decisions around her, he had sometimes made decisions for her, and then allowed her to believe they had been made together. That realization hurt more than any single document, because it meant the problem hadn't begun with the divorce. The divorce had only forced Josephine to finally look backward. Gabriel noticed the change before Josephine said anything. It happened on a Thursday evening. He came home later than usual, set his keys beside the bowl near the front door, and loosened his tie while walking into the kitchen. Josephine was sitting at the table with a stack of papers in front of her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even looking at him. She was reading. Gabriel stopped. "What are those?" Josephine lifted her eyes. "Documents." "I can see that." She waited. Gabriel walked closer. "Are those from the divorce?" "Some of them." He looked at the papers, then at her. "You've been going through old files?" "Yes." "Why?" Josephine closed the folder. "Because I want to understand them." Gabriel's expression tightened slightly. "You're getting legal advice, right?" "Yes." "Then let your attorney handle it." "Will." He waited. Something about her answer bothered him. For years, Josephine had usually explained herself when he asked questions. This time, she didn't. Gabriel pulled out the chair opposite her. "Josephine, what's going on?" She looked at him for several seconds. "Do you remember Daniel Mercer?" The change in Gabriel's face was small, but Josephine saw it. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes moved away for half a second. Then he leaned back. "Of course I remember Daniel. He worked for you." "Yes, he was the project manager on the Mercer Center project." Gabriel frowned. "It was years ago." "I know. Why are we talking about him?" Josephine reached into the folder. She didn't slide the document across the table. She simply held it. "I met his wife." Gabriel's face became still. "When?" "Outside the courthouse." "You met Marlene?" "Yes." He stared at her. "What did she want?" "She showed me some documents." Gabriel stood. "Josephine, don't." She looked up. "Don't what? Let her pull you into this." "You haven't even asked me what the documents say." "I don't need to." "Why?" "Because I know what happened." Josephine watched him carefully. "Then explain it." Gabriel walked toward the kitchen counter. "Daniel was investigated." "I know. He was responsible for financial irregularities on that project." "That isn't what his wife says." Gabriel turned. "His wife is grieving. She didn't accuse you. She doesn't have to." Josephine's brow furrowed. Gabriel continued. "People spend years looking for someone to blame after they lose somebody. That's human nature." Josephine felt the familiar pull inside her, the old instinct to soften, to reassure him, to say she understood. But she didn't, not this time. "Did you know Daniel had concerns before the project went wrong?" Gabriel stared at her. "Josephine, I don't remember every conversation from a decade ago." "Did you?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" "No." His voice remained calm. That calmness had once reassured her. Now it made her pay closer attention. Josephine placed one document on the table. "What about this?" Gabriel looked at it. His eyes moved across the page. He didn't touch it. "That is old business paperwork. I know. You don't understand how these companies operate. Then explain it." "Josephine, explain it." Gabriel looked at her. For a moment the room was completely quiet. Then he said, "You're allowing a grieving widow to manipulate you." Josephine felt something tighten in her chest. "That isn't fair." "Isn't it?" "No. After everything we've been through, you're going to believe a stranger over me?" The question landed exactly where Gabriel intended it to. Josephine felt herself slipping toward the answer she had given him hundreds of times. "Don't believe her. I'm sorry. Trust you." But this time she stopped. She looked at the man sitting across from her, the husband she had loved for 18 years, the man whose schedule she had memorized, whose meals she had prepared, whose company she had helped organize, whose dreams she had protected as though they were her own. Then she looked at the document. "No," she said quietly. Gabriel waited. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" Josephine took a breath. "I'm finally asking questions before I decide what to believe." Gabriel's expression changed, Not dramatically, there was no shouting, no slammed door. But something disappeared from his face. For the first time, Josephine realized that he had expected her to seek his explanation before seeking anything else. She had always asked him first. This time, she hadn't. Gabriel picked up the document. "You're making a mistake. Maybe. You don't understand what you're looking at. Then help me understand." "I already told you." "No," Josephine said. "You told me I didn't understand." He looked at her. Josephine continued, "That's different." Gabriel put the paper down. "You're letting this divorce turn you against me." Josephine shook her head. "No. Then what is this?" She looked at the folders surrounding her. "It's me trying to understand my own life." He didn't answer. Josephine's voice became quieter. "I don't know yet what these documents mean. I don't know what Daniel knew. I don't know what you knew, and I don't know what happened." She held his gaze. "But I'm going to find out." Gabriel stood there for several seconds. Then he picked up his keys. "Be careful, Josephine." She watched him walk toward the door. The words weren't threatening, at least not openly. But Josephine understood something she hadn't understood before. Gabriel was no longer trying to convince her that nothing had happened. He was trying to convince her not to keep looking. The door closed behind him. Josephine remained at the table. She looked at the document bearing her name. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't put it away. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of a clean page: "Find out what is true." Then beneath it, she wrote the first question: "Why was my name connected to Gabriel's business?" The sentence Josephine had written in her notebook remained on the table for several days. Find out what is true. She had expected the investigation to give her an answer quickly. Instead, it gave her more questions. The documents Marlene had brought were important, but they were not enough to establish exactly what had happened. Josephine understood that now. A name on a financial record did not automatically explain why it was there. An email did not necessarily reveal an entire conversation. No matter how sincere, could still be incomplete. So Josephine stopped looking for the piece of paper that would prove everything. She started looking for the sequence of events. With the help of the appropriate professionals, old company records were reviewed. Former employees were contacted. Dates were compared against invoices, project correspondence, payment records, and internal approvals. Marlene provided copies of Daniel's notes. Daniel had been meticulous. His handwriting appeared in the margins of old documents. He had written dates beside conversations and noted when he had raised concerns. One entry caught Josephine's attention. Daniel had written down the date he first questioned several transactions. The date came months before the financial problems became public. Josephine read it twice. Then she looked at the corresponding company records. Daniel had not been hiding his concerns. He had documented them. Another former employee confirmed that Daniel had raised questions during meetings. A second person remembered that Gabriel had been aware of the problems. Neither person accused Gabriel of personally taking money. That distinction became increasingly important. The evidence did not support the simple story Josephine had feared. Gabriel had not secretly engineered every financial irregularity. Some expenses were legitimate. Some projections had been wrong. Some decisions had been made by people whose judgment had simply been poor. The project itself had been financially complicated. But there was something else. Gabriel had known Daniel was concerned. He had known Daniel had questioned certain decisions, and when the project began collapsing under financial pressure, Gabriel had allowed the responsibility to settle on Daniel. That was where the truth became difficult. Gabriel had not needed to invent an elaborate conspiracy. He had only needed to remain silent at the moments when speaking would have protected someone else. Daniel had been the easiest person to blame because he was close enough to the paperwork and far enough from the company's leadership to absorb the consequences. There were emails showing that Gabriel knew Daniel had raised concerns. There were records showing that some decisions Daniel had been blamed for were connected to instructions that came from above him. There were also communications showing Gabriel discussing the company's need to protect its reputation. Josephine sat with those records spread across her dining table. She expected to feel furious. Instead, she felt tired, because the truth was uglier than the version she had feared. There was no single moment when Gabriel had decided to become a bad man. There had been smaller decisions, a decision to avoid correcting a misunderstanding, a decision to let someone else answer a difficult question, a decision to protect the company, a decision to protect himself. Each one had probably felt temporary. Each one had made the next decision easier. Josephine thought about how often Gabriel had told her that problems became dangerous when people panicked. He had always believed in controlling situations. Now she wondered whether that instinct had eventually controlled him. Marlene called one evening. "Have you found anything?" Josephine looked at the documents. "Yes." Marlene waited. Josephine chose her words carefully. Daniel wasn't responsible for everything they blamed him for. Marlene's breathing changed. "I knew it. I know." "No," Marlene said quietly. "You don't understand. I needed somebody to say that." Josephine closed her eyes. "But there were also mistakes," she said. "Real ones. The project had serious financial problems." Marlene was silent, and Gabriel wasn't responsible for every one of them. Josephine heard the disappointment in her own voice when she said it. She had wanted a cleaner answer. She had wanted the documents to reveal a villain and a victim. Instead, they revealed people making choices under pressure, some defensible and some not. Marlene eventually said, "But he knew Daniel wasn't solely responsible." "Yes, and he let him take the blame." Josephine looked down. "Yes." The line went quiet. Neither woman needed to say more. That was the part Josephine found hardest to accept. Gabriel had not needed to destroy Daniel deliberately. He had simply needed to protect himself when protecting Daniel became inconvenient. And sometimes, Josephine realized, the most damaging betrayals were not committed through dramatic acts. They happened through silence, through what a person chose not to correct, through the truth they allowed others to believe. Josephine closed Daniel's file. She had started this investigation because she wanted to know whether Gabriel had lied to her. Now she was beginning to understand a larger truth. People rarely ruined their lives with one enormous decision. More often they crossed small lines repeatedly until they could no longer remember where the first line had been, and Gabriel had crossed enough of them that Josephine could no longer pretend the pattern wasn't there. The more Josephine learned about Gabriel, the more uncomfortable the investigation became. Not because the evidence was weakening, because it was forcing her to look at herself too. One Saturday morning, she sat at Renee's kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. There were 2 columns on the page. On the left, Josephine had written, "What Gabriel did." On the right, "What I allowed." She had started the list because she wanted to separate facts from emotions. Under Gabriel's name, she had written about the career opportunity, the financial information he had withheld, the documents connected to his business, the way he had allowed Daniel to carry blame he knew was not entirely deserved. Then she stared at the second column. For a long time it remained empty. Renee came into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She looked at the page. "You've been sitting there for 20 minutes. "I know. What are you trying to write?" Josephine tapped the pen against the table. "I don't want to make Gabriel responsible for every bad thing that happened to me." Renee sat down. "That's fair. I stopped working. Yes. I let him handle most of the finances. Yes. I avoided conversations because I knew they'd become arguments. Yes." Josephine looked up. "You're agreeing very quickly." Renee smiled faintly. "You asked me to be honest." "I did, so I'm being honest." Josephine looked back at the paper. "I stayed." Renee didn't answer immediately. "Yes," she finally said. Josephine swallowed. "I stayed even when I knew I wasn't happy." "You were scared." "That doesn't change it." "No," Renee said, "but it explains it." Josephine lowered her eyes. There was something liberating about hearing that. She had spent so long moving between 2 extremes. Either Gabriel was responsible for everything, or she was somehow foolish for staying. Neither was true. She had made choices. So had Gabriel. Her choices did not excuse his. His choices did not erase hers. Renee reached across the table. Taking responsibility for your choices doesn't mean taking responsibility for his. Josephine looked at her. Renee repeated it more slowly. You can admit where you were passive without pretending you caused what he did. Josephine wrote the sentence down. She knew she would remember it. For the next several hours, she continued the list. She wrote about the time she had avoided financial conversations because Gabriel seemed more confident. She wrote about the time she had accepted his decisions because arguing felt exhausting. She wrote about how often she had told herself that she would deal with things later. And she wrote about the career opportunity. That one hurt the most, because Gabriel had influenced it, but Josephine had also allowed herself to accept his explanation without checking what had actually happened. She had trusted him. That wasn't a crime, but trust without curiosity had left her vulnerable. Josephine closed the notebook. I wish I had asked more questions. Renee nodded. Then ask them now. Josephine looked at her. What if I had asked back then? Maybe things would have changed. Maybe they wouldn't have. Josephine sighed. That uncertainty is hard. It always is. They sat quietly. Then Josephine said, I don't want my whole life to become about what Gabriel did. Renee smiled. Then don't make it about him. Josephine looked toward the window. Outside, a neighbor was bringing groceries from a car. A child was riding a bicycle along the sidewalk. Normal life. That was what Josephine wanted. Not a perfect life. Not a life in which nobody ever hurt her. A life in which she participated in her own decisions. That evening she returned home and opened the folder containing the old documents. For the first time, she deliberately looked for evidence that challenged her own interpretation. She found some. Gabriel had made legitimate financial contributions. He had worked long hours. He had carried risks that Josephine hadn't always understood. There were decisions where he had acted responsibly. There were moments when he had genuinely supported her. Josephine didn't throw those facts away. She wrote them down too. That was when she understood, something she hadn't been ready to accept before. The marriage had not been entirely false. The love had not necessarily been false. The good years had not been meaningless simply because the later years had become unhealthy. Gabriel could have loved her and still controlled her. He could have believed he was protecting their family and still damaged her independence. He could have been under enormous pressure and still made morally wrong decisions. Two truths could exist at the same time. Josephine closed the folder. She felt no triumph, only clarity. And clarity, she was beginning to discover, was more useful than anger. She didn't need to turn Gabriel into a monster to justify leaving him. She didn't need to turn herself into a victim to deserve a new beginning. She only needed to tell the truth accurately, even when the truth included her own mistakes. The review did not end with a dramatic announcement. There was no crowded courtroom, no reporter waiting outside, no moment when Gabriel was publicly confronted and forced to confess everything he had done. The truth came together the way most difficult truths did, slowly, through documents, through conversations, through people comparing what they remembered with what the records actually showed. By the time the review reached its conclusion, enough evidence had been gathered to establish something that had been missing from Daniel's story for years. Daniel had not been solely responsible for the financial misconduct attributed to him. He had raised concerns about the project. Some decisions he had been blamed for had been made with authorization from above him, and Gabriel had known enough about those circumstances that he could not honestly claim he had believed Daniel was acting alone. That conclusion did not mean Gabriel had personally committed every financial irregularity. It meant something more uncomfortable. He had known the official story was incomplete and had allowed it to stand. For Marlene, the conclusion was devastating and relieving at the same time. She received the formal confirmation on a gray afternoon. Josephine was with her when she opened it. Marlene read the letter once, then again. Her hands began to shake. He wasn't crazy, she whispered. Josephine said nothing. He kept telling me they had it wrong. Marlene pressed the letter against her chest. He kept saying somebody would eventually look at the records. Josephine reached for her hand. Marlene cried quietly. Not the loud kind of crying Josephine had seen in movies, just tears that kept coming while Marlene sat perfectly still. Josephine cried too. She had never known Daniel well, but she understood what it meant for a person's name to become attached to something they did not deserve. For years Daniel had carried that reputation. Now the record had changed. It could not give him those years back. It could not give Marlene back the husband she had lost. But it could stop the false version of his story from becoming permanent. Gabriel's professional reputation suffered afterward. Some clients asked questions. Some business relationships became strained. People who had once praised his judgment became more cautious, but others defended him. Some insisted that the review had gone too far. Others believed Gabriel had simply made difficult decisions during a complicated project. Josephine found that surprisingly painful. She had imagined that once the evidence was clear, everyone would see the truth exactly as she did. They didn't. One evening she told Renee about it. "I don't understand how people can read the same information and come away with different conclusions." Renee looked at her. "Because people don't only read information. What do they read? Their own loyalties, their own experiences, what they want to believe." Josephine thought about that. For years, Gabriel had controlled the story around himself. He had been the successful businessman, the provider, the man who built something from nothing, the husband who carried the financial burden. Josephine had once helped reinforce that image without realizing it. Now she understood that she could not control how other people remembered him. And she didn't want to. Her own divorce negotiations continued alongside everything else. They were less dramatic than Josephine had expected, and more exhausting than she had imagined. There were meetings about property, discussions about finances, questions about accounts and responsibilities. Her attorney reviewed documents carefully. Gabriel's attorney proposed terms. Josephine asked questions. When something didn't make sense, she stopped the conversation. "I need to understand that number." The first few times she said it, she felt almost embarrassed. Then she noticed something. Nobody laughed. Nobody told her she was incapable. People simply explained the number. That realization stayed with her. For 18 years she had treated not understanding something as evidence that she was less qualified to question it. Now she was discovering that asking questions was not weakness. It was participation. During one negotiation, Gabriel looked across the table at her. "You've changed." Josephine met his eyes. "I have. You don't trust me at all anymore." She thought about the question. "I don't think trust works the way I thought it did." Gabriel leaned back. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't have to believe everything you say just because I love you." His face tightened. "You loved me." "I did." Past tense? Josephine looked down briefly. "I loved the man I believed we were becoming together." Gabriel didn't respond. She continued. "That doesn't mean every good memory was fake." He looked away. For once, Josephine didn't try to make the silence comfortable. Gabriel had spent years believing that if he remained calm enough, confident enough, and organized enough, he could control how difficult situations unfolded. But Josephine was no longer asking him to explain her own life to her. She was reading the documents. She was asking questions. She was making decisions. And that meant he could no longer negotiate with the woman who had once accepted his certainty as proof. He had to negotiate with her as an equal. Josephine left the meeting that afternoon without feeling victorious. There was no satisfaction in watching Gabriel struggle. Instead, she felt something quieter. She finally understood that justice and revenge were not the same thing. Justice meant allowing the truth to stand. Revenge meant needing someone else to suffer before she could feel whole. Josephine no longer wanted the second one. She had already lost too many years making her life revolve around Gabriel. She wasn't going to spend the rest of it doing the same thing in anger. She walked toward her car and held her coat closed against the wind. The divorce was still unfinished. Her future was still uncertain. But for the first time, Josephine wasn't waiting for Gabriel to decide what happened next. She was beginning to decide for herself. The divorce was finalized on an ordinary weekday morning. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no last-minute confession that changed everything. Josephine sat quietly while the final documents were reviewed, listening as the terms of the settlement were explained. There were compromises. Some property had to be divided. Accounts had to be separated. Certain expenses had to be assigned. There were things Josephine had hoped to keep and things Gabriel had wanted to keep. Neither of them received everything. That was probably the most honest ending their marriage could have had. When the final paperwork was completed, Josephine looked down at the signature in front of her. For 18 years she had signed her name beside Gabriel's on documents that represented a shared life. Now she was signing her name to end it. Her hand paused briefly. Then she signed. The room remained quiet. Gabriel sat across from her. He looked older than he had a year earlier. Not dramatically older, just tired. The confidence that had once seemed permanent had softened. Josephine gathered her papers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Gabriel finally said, "I never wanted it to end like this." Josephine looked at him. "I know. I thought I was doing what was best." Josephine considered that. "I believe you." Gabriel seemed surprised. "You do?" "Yes." He looked down. Josephine continued. "But believing that doesn't change what happened." Gabriel nodded slowly. "I know. You made decisions for me. I thought I was protecting us. You were." He looked at her. Josephine's voice remained calm. "You were protecting what you thought our life needed to be. But you didn't ask me whether that was the life I wanted." Gabriel didn't argue. For once there was nothing useful he could say. Josephine gathered the remaining papers. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel relieved in the way she had imagined. She felt grief. There had been real love in their marriage, real laughter, real holidays, real mornings when Gabriel had kissed her forehead before leaving for work. There had been difficult years too. But the good memories didn't disappear simply because the marriage had ended badly. Josephine understood that now. She could mourn what had been beautiful without returning to what had become unhealthy. Outside the building, she stood on the sidewalk and took a slow breath. The divorce had not made her wealthy. It had not erased 18 years. It had not repaired every mistake. And it certainly had not turned her into an entirely different person overnight. She still had bills. She still had uncertainty. She still had moments when she woke up and instinctively reached for her phone because she thought she needed to check Gabriel's schedule. Then she remembered. She didn't. That small realization happened more often than she expected. A week after the divorce, Josephine received a message from Gabriel. He wanted to talk. She agreed to meet him at a quiet coffee shop. When he arrived, he looked uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," he said. Josephine waited. "I know I made mistakes." She didn't rescue him from the silence. Gabriel continued. "I thought if I handled everything, you wouldn't have to worry." Josephine nodded. "I believe that. But I didn't realize what it was doing to you." She looked at him. "That was the problem." He lowered his eyes. "I thought you were okay because you stopped arguing." Josephine almost smiled. "I stopped arguing because I didn't think it would change anything." Gabriel absorbed that. "I should have listened." "Yes, I should have told you more about the finances." "Yes, and I shouldn't have interfered with that job." Josephine's expression changed slightly. "That one hurt." "I know." He looked at her. Was afraid everything would change. Josephine looked down at her coffee. "Everything did change." Gabriel nodded. "I know. There was no reconciliation waiting for them. Josephine wasn't looking for one. But there was something else. Accountability. Not perfect accountability. Not a speech that erased years of control. Just a man finally acknowledging that good intentions did not cancel consequences. Josephine stood when the conversation ended. Gabriel remained seated. "Josephine." She turned. "I really did love you." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know." Then she walked outside. The cold air hit her face. She pulled her coat tighter and started toward her car. For years she had thought freedom would feel like winning. It didn't. It felt quieter. It felt like walking away from a conversation without needing the other person to agree with her. And as Josephine drove home that afternoon, she realized the divorce had not given her a new life. It had simply given her the authority to begin building one. The first interview Josephine went to after the divorce lasted 43 minutes. She knew because she had checked the clock on her phone twice. The position was with a Minneapolis development organization, and although the job description looked familiar, the interview made Josephine realize how much the professional world had changed while she had been away. The interviewer asked about project management software she had never used. Josephine answered honestly, "I haven't worked with that system." The younger woman across the table glanced at her resume. "But you managed construction documentation before?" "Yes." "For how long?" Josephine hesitated. "Several years." She could have explained that she had done far more than that. She had handled schedules, invoices, vendor communication, deadlines, and project paperwork for Gabriel's company. But most of it had never carried her name professionally. She had been helping her husband. That distinction suddenly felt enormous. When the interview ended, Josephine walked to her car and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. She felt embarrassed, then angry at herself for feeling embarrassed, then tired. She looked at the resume sitting on the passenger seat. There was an employment gap on the page. Years of it. The paper made those years look empty. Josephine knew they hadn't been. She had simply never learned how to explain their value without explaining Gabriel. A few weeks later, she received an offer. It wasn't her dream position. The salary wasn't extraordinary. But when she read the email, she sat quietly at her kitchen table and smiled. It was hers. On her first morning, Josephine arrived early. She spent 10 minutes trying to figure out where the coffee supplies were before finally asking someone. The woman at the next desk laughed. "First week?" Josephine smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." They both laughed. It was a small moment, but Josephine liked it. Nobody expected her to know everything. Nobody expected her to already understand the building. Nobody expected her to know where every document belonged. She was simply new, and being new felt strangely freeing. There were embarrassing moments. A younger coworker showed her a software shortcut she hadn't known. Josephine thanked her. Later, she caught herself feeling inadequate. She had once been the person who knew where everything was. Now she was asking questions. Then she remembered something Renee had told her. Asking questions wasn't weakness, so she asked another, and another. Within months, Josephine began recognizing how much she already knew. She understood deadlines. She understood difficult personalities. She knew how to notice when two departments were working from different assumptions. She knew how to organize chaos. Those skills had never disappeared. They had simply been invisible. At home, she began rebuilding her finances, too. The first time Josephine opened an account in her own name, she stared at the confirmation screen longer than necessary. It was almost ridiculous. It was just a bank account. But to her, it represented something larger. Her money had a place that belonged entirely to her. She began learning. She read financial statements. She asked questions about investments. She learned the difference between things she understood and things she didn't. When she didn't understand something, she no longer pretended. One evening, she called Renee. "I think I finally understand what you meant." "About what?" "Information." Renee laughed. "That narrows it down." Josephine smiled. "I used to think asking questions made me difficult." "You were trained to think that." Josephine went quiet. "I don't want to live like that anymore." "You don't have to." Her friendships changed too. Josephine started accepting invitations she had once declined. Coffee after work, dinner with old friends, a Saturday afternoon helping Renee shop for furniture. Nothing dramatic, just life returning in small pieces. One evening she found herself laughing so hard at Renee's kitchen table that she had to put down her glass. She stopped halfway through the laugh. For a second she wondered when she had last laughed like that. Not politely, not because someone else expected it. Really laughed. Renee noticed. "What?" Josephine shook her head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was evidence. Josephine was beginning to recognize herself again. She still had difficult days. There were mornings when loneliness arrived before she had even gotten out of bed. There were bills that made her nervous. There were moments when she questioned whether leaving had been worth the uncertainty, but she no longer interpreted uncertainty as proof that she had made the wrong decision. Sometimes uncertainty simply meant she was doing something new. And slowly, Josephine stopped apologizing for wanting to know what was happening in her own life. When someone handed her a document, she read it. When something didn't make sense, she asked. When she disagreed, she said so. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. That was perhaps the biggest change. Josephine had spent years believing independence required becoming hard. Instead, she discovered that she could remain kind without becoming passive. She could forgive without forgetting. She could admit her mistakes without surrendering her voice. And she could build a life that didn't need to be justified by another person's approval. The woman who had once organized everyone else's future was finally learning how to plan her own. Several months after the divorce, Josephine left work later than usual. It was already dark when she stepped outside the Minneapolis office building. The cold had settled into the streets, and a thin layer of snow lined the curb where cars had passed during the afternoon. Josephine pulled her coat tighter around herself and walked toward the parking lot, her breath visible in the air. She reached her car but didn't get in immediately. Instead, she stood beside it with her keys in her hand. For some reason, she thought about the courthouse, not the divorce itself, the morning, the way she had walked toward the building carrying a thin folder against her chest, convinced she had already lost everything that mattered. She remembered how small she had felt, how certain she had been that Gabriel knew what he was doing while she was simply trying to survive it. Then she remembered Marlene, that quiet woman standing outside the courthouse, the document bearing Josephine's name, the questions that followed, Daniel's reputation, the investigation, the divorce, everything that had happened since. Josephine sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. She didn't start the engine, she simply sat there. For a long time, she had imagined that the greatest victory would be Gabriel admitting he had been wrong. At one point, she had wanted him to understand exactly what he had taken from her. Her career, her confidence, her independence, her ability to trust her own judgment. But as time passed, that desire began to disappear, because Josephine had discovered something she hadn't understood when the marriage ended. If her happiness depended on Gabriel finally understanding her pain, then Gabriel would still have control over her life. She didn't want that, not anymore. She rested her hands on the steering wheel. Gabriel had made choices he had no right to make for her. He had interfered with an opportunity that belonged to her. He had withheld information. He had allowed his own mistakes to affect another man's reputation. Those things were real. Josephine wasn't going to minimize them. But she also knew she had made choices. She had avoided difficult conversations. She had allowed Gabriel to take control because uncertainty frightened her. She had convinced herself that keeping peace was the same thing as protecting the marriage. Sometimes it was easier to say, "Whatever you think is best," than to ask questions she was afraid might start an argument. She couldn't change that woman, but she could stop being her. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Marlene. "Thinking of Daniel today. Hope you're doing well." Josephine smiled. She typed a reply. "I'm doing better. Still learning." Marlene responded a few minutes later. "That's all any of us can do." Josephine looked at the message for a while. Daniel's name had been cleared. It hadn't repaired everything. It hadn't returned the years he had spent defending himself. But his story was no longer frozen in the version that had been used against him. And Josephine realized her own story was changing too. She no longer wanted to describe herself as the woman Gabriel had controlled. That was part of her history. It wasn't her identity. She started the car. The heater blew cold air for several seconds before warming. Josephine smiled at the windshield. There was something almost comforting about that. Not everything worked immediately. Sometimes things needed time. She pulled out of the parking space and headed home through the Minneapolis streets. The city looked different from the way it had looked that morning outside the courthouse. Maybe the city hadn't changed. Maybe she had. At a red light, Josephine looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She thought about the 32-year-old woman who had walked into court alone. That woman had believed she was losing her future. Josephine wished she could reach back through time and tell her something. She would tell her that being uncertain didn't mean being defeated, that asking questions wasn't disrespectful, that love didn't require surrendering judgment, and that taking responsibility for her own mistakes didn't mean carrying somebody else's. The light turned green. Josephine drove on. She didn't know exactly what the next 5 years would look like. She didn't know whether she would remarry. She didn't know whether she would eventually own a home, change careers again, or build something completely different. For once, she didn't need to know. The uncertainty didn't frighten her. It felt open. It felt honest. It felt like freedom. Josephine pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine. She sat quietly for another moment before stepping out into the cold. Then she walked toward her front door, carrying nothing but her bag, her keys, and the life she was finally learning to call her own. And perhaps that was the part Josephine had misunderstood all those years. Independence was never about proving that she could live without Gabriel. It was about becoming someone who could look at her own life, ask her own questions, make her own decisions, and trust herself with the answers. For the first time in 18 years, Josephine didn't know exactly where her life was going, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of that. The future was uncertain, but it belonged to her. If Josephine's story reminded you of something you've experienced in your own life, take a moment and ask yourself this. Are you making your decisions because they truly reflect what you want, or because you're afraid of what someone else might think? Sometimes starting over doesn't mean losing everything. Sometimes it means finally discovering the parts of yourself you stopped listening to. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Daily Comfort Stories, and share it with someone who may need to hear this message today.